By the time the judge finished reading her ruling, Derek Holloway couldn't look at anyone in that courtroom. Not the bailiff, not his own attorney, not me. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, the way you hold still when you're trying to convince a room you're calm. 3 years earlier, I didn't even know he'd taken anything at all. I found out by accident in a lockbox my grandfather trusted only me to open. And once I opened it, there was no way for Derek to talk his way out of what came next. Welcome to Revenge Story, where we don't do loud. We do lawyers, paperwork, and patience. If you're new here, hit subscribe. And if you've ever had a relative decide your quiet devotion made you an easy mark, drop a comment and tell me who. In a minute, I'm going to tell you exactly how quiet devotion can also make you dangerous. Let me take you back to where this actually started. My name is Melanie Kessler. I'm 39 years old, and for the last 11 years, I've worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized estate and trust law firm, which is either a strange coincidence or the exact reason none of this ended the way Derek expected it to. I spend my days drafting trust documents, calendaring probate deadlines, and proofreading language most people never read twice in their lives. I am, by profession and by personality, the person who checks things. My mother used to joke that I came out of the womb double-checking the paperwork, and by the time I was in high school, nobody in the family argued with her about it. My coworkers still tease me for reading every renewal notice on my phone plan word for word before I sign anything, even electronically. It turns out that particular habit is exactly what saved my grandfather's estate. My cousin Derek Holloway is 2 years older than me, the son of my mother's older sister, Carol Holloway. Growing up, Derek was the golden one, the one who always had a plan, always knew somebody, always seemed one phone call away from solving whatever problem the family happened to be having that particular week. At Thanksgiving, Derek was the one who carved. At funerals, Derek was the one who gave the eulogy, even when it wasn't technically his turn. He became a licensed financial planner in his late 20s, and for a long time that felt like exactly the right career for him. He managed my grandmother's retirement accounts back in 2015. He helped my Aunt Carol refinance her house 2 years after that. Derek was useful, and in our family, being useful is its own kind of currency, the kind that buys you the benefit of the doubt for a very long time, long after other people might have started asking questions. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. Derek was likable, genuinely likable, not likable in the fake, performative way villains are likable in movies. He remembered your birthday. He showed up early to help you move. His wife, Jessica, was warm and funny and the kind of person who sent thoughtful cards for no reason at all. That matters because it's the reason nobody questioned Derek for as long as they did, including me. I remember one Thanksgiving back in 2020 when my grandmother had only been gone a few months and the whole family was still figuring out how to sit around a table without her. Someone brought up how much I'd taken on with my grandfather's care, and Derek raised his glass and said, "Family always comes first. I'm just glad someone's doing what's right for all of us." I remember feeling grateful for it at the time, like he was acknowledging something nobody else quite had the words for. I didn't know then that I'd hear that same sentence, almost word for word, so many more times over the next few years, or that it would eventually be the thing I couldn't stop hearing while I sat in a courtroom listening to him explain himself under oath. My grandfather, Walter Kessler, was 84 years old when he died. He and my grandmother, Ruth, raised 4 children in the same house on Larkspur Street for 46 years. And when she passed away in the spring of 2019, something in him just slowed down the way it does for people who've spent their whole lives as half of a pair. He had late-stage kidney disease by then, dialysis 3 times a week, a hip that never quite healed right after a fall the previous winter, and an absolute immovable refusal to leave the house he'd lived in since 1974, no matter how many times a well-meaning doctor suggested assisted living.
I was the one who moved him in with me, not my mother, who lived 2 states away by then and had her own health issues to manage, not Aunt Carol, who said more than once that she had her own stress to deal with, not Derek, who had the kind of job that didn't really allow for that kind of disruption. Me. I converted my home office into a bedroom with a hospital rail bolted into the wall and a walk-in shower installed that spring, and for the next 5 years, I drove my grandfather to dialysis 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 140 minutes round trip every single time, rain or shine, through 5 different winters, including the ice storm of 2021, when I drove 11 miles an hour the entire way because I was not about to be the reason he missed treatment. I remember him gripping the door handle that morning, laughing under his breath and saying, "Ruth would have made me stay home," and me telling him Grandma wasn't the one driving, so we were going. He didn't miss a single session in 5 years, not one. I paid for the home health aide who covered the mornings I had court filings due, straight out of my own paycheck, because his insurance only covered a fraction of what round-the-clock care actually cost. There was a stretch in late 2022 when I was working full days at the firm, then coming home to manage medications, and I remember sitting on my bathroom floor at 11 at night doing the math on whether I could afford another 6 months of the aide's hours, and deciding I could, because the alternative wasn't something I was willing to consider. By the time he died, I had put just over $46,000 of my own money into his care, on top of 5 years of Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays that I will never get back and don't regret for a single second. In the spring of 2019, right after we'd settled into that new routine, my grandfather sat me down at his kitchen table with a manila folder and a pen. I remember the folder because it was the same faded green one he'd always kept his important documents in, going back as long as I could remember. Tax returns, the deed to the house, my grandmother's old recipe cards tucked in behind everything else. "I already talked to my attorney," he told me, sliding it across the table. "When I'm gone, you're the one who gets taken care of. The house, the accounts, all of it. It's yours, Mel. You're the only one who never asked me for anything." He signed a revocable living trust that day, naming me as primary beneficiary of an estate that, between the house, his investment accounts, and a life insurance policy, was worth just over $2 million. Derek was named successor trustee. Someone had to handle the logistics when the time came, and Derek was on paper the responsible one with the financial background. A licensed advisor, someone who understood probate timelines and tax implications better than the rest of us ever would. I didn't fight that part of it. I actually remember feeling relieved that I wouldn't have to deal with the administrative side of things.
Was grieving. I trusted him. That's really the whole story of what happened next. I trusted him right up until the moment trust stopped being enough to protect anyone. My grandfather spent 31 years working as a machinist foreman at a manufacturing plant 2 towns over. The kind of job where you learn to measure things twice and trust nothing you haven't verified yourself. A habit I apparently inherited more directly than I ever expected to. He wasn't a man who talked about money often, but he talked about fairness constantly. Who got the bigger slice of pie at holidays? Who'd done the dishes last time? Whose turn it was to host? He believed deeply and simply that people who showed up for you deserved to be shown up for in return. I think that belief is the entire reason the 2019 trust said what it said, and I think it's the entire reason the version of that document Derek produced in 2023 could never actually have come from him. I should also say, for context, that I've never married and don't have children of my own, which is part of why moving my grandfather in wasn't the logistical mountain for me that it might have been for my mother, juggling her own household 2 states away, or for Carol, who still had teenagers at home in 2019. That's not a complaint. It's just the arithmetic that made me the obvious answer to a question nobody else in the family particularly wanted to volunteer for. My grandfather died in March of last year, on a Tuesday morning, quietly, in his sleep, the way you'd want someone you love to go if you don't get a choice in the matter. I was the one who found him, on my way to wake him for his 6 a.m. dialysis appointment. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it matters for what comes later. I was the one who was there, Every single time, for 5 straight years, including the last one. The funeral was small, the way he would have wanted it. A handful of neighbors, the pastor who'd married him and my grandmother 49 years earlier. Derek gave the eulogy, the way he always did for our family, and he spoke for almost 10 minutes about how much my grandfather valued taking care of the people you love without expecting anything in return. I remember thinking, standing there in the cold, that it was a strange thing for him to emphasize, without understanding yet exactly how strange. 2 weeks after the funeral, our family's longtime attorney, not Barrick, an actual outside attorney my grandfather had used for over 20 years, called a meeting to go over the trust. I sat down at that same law office expecting the conversation we'd had at his kitchen table 5 years earlier. Instead, the attorney slid across a document I had never seen in my life, a trust amendment dated 3 weeks before my grandfather died, naming Derek as primary beneficiary of the entire estate and reducing my share to a fixed $10,000, described in the document as being for sentimental items only. My mother, sitting beside me, actually laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound, before she realized nobody else in the room was joking. "That has to be a mistake," she said. "Mel lived with him. Mel drove him to every single appointment for 5 years. The attorney, visibly uncomfortable, said only that his job was to present the most recent validly executed document on file. Derek didn't laugh. Derek looked down at his hands and said quietly that he knew this would be hard to hear and that he'd tried to talk Grandpa out of some of it honestly, a detail I would think about a great deal later once I understood what it actually meant. I remember staring at the signature at the bottom of that page for a long time. My grandfather's hands had been shaking badly by the end. Dialysis does that, especially near the end, so I told myself the unevenness in the signature didn't necessarily mean anything. I told myself a lot of things that afternoon that, looking back now, I only believed because believing them was easier than the alternative. For the first few weeks after that meeting, I told myself it was grief making things feel wrong that weren't actually wrong. Then a few small things started to stack up, the way they always do once you finally start paying attention. Derek stopped returning my calls about the estate. Not dramatically, he never once said he was avoiding me, just always in a meeting, always traveling for work, always going to circle back next week about the accounting. When I asked to see the formal trust accounting, which as successor trustee he was legally required to provide within a reasonable time, he told me his attorney was still compiling it. Weeks turned into 2 months. In May, I found out from a neighbor, not from Derek, that my grandfather's house on Larkspur Street, the house I had lived in for 5 years, the house with the hospital rails still bolted into the wall of my old office, had been quietly listed for sale. Nobody in the family had been consulted. Nobody had even been told. The listing photos still showed my grandmother's curtains in the front windows, and the listing description called it a handyman's opportunity, which felt like its own small insult after everything that house had actually held. Around that same time, I asked Derek's wife, Jessica, in what I thought was a casual conversation at my mother's birthday dinner, whether she knew anything about the estate timeline. Jessica went quiet in a way that felt very different from her usual warmth, glanced toward Derek across the room, and changed the subject to the dessert, asking whether I'd tried the bakery's new lemon cake. I didn't think much of it that night, distracted by my own grief and by everyone else's careful small talk around it. I've thought about it a great deal since. And when I asked my Aunt Carol, gently, whether she'd seen any of the amendment paperwork before my grandfather supposedly signed it, she got very still and very quiet and said, "You'll have to ask Derek about that," in a tone that told me she already knew more than she wanted to say out loud to my face. In June, I drove to Derek's own office, still trying to handle this the reasonable way, and asked to see the physical trust file he was required to maintain as trustee.
His assistant told me apologetically that Derek keeps that cabinet locked and takes the key with him, and that she wasn't authorized to open it without him present. I stood in that reception area for a full minute deciding whether to make a scene, and then I didn't. I left my card and asked her to have him call me. He didn't. If you're the person in your family who quietly keeps track of things, the one who remembers the dates, keeps the receipts, notices when a story doesn't add up, this next part is for you. Subscribe to Revenge Story because staying observant is exactly what's about to matter most in this story, and it might matter in yours too. Here's the thing about caregiving for 5 years. You end up with keys nobody else has. I still had the key to my grandfather's fireproof lockbox, the one he kept in his bedroom closet behind a stack of old sweaters, the one he stored his birth certificate, my grandmother's wedding rings, and it turned out a second original copy of every version of his trust he had ever signed. I want you to remember that lockbox, because it's the reason this entire story ends the way it does. 2 months after the funeral, before the house sale could close, I drove over with my mother to collect the last of his things before strangers walked through those rooms. I remember the house smelled like it always had, like his aftershave and the cedar closet, and for a minute I just stood in the doorway of what used to be my bedroom for 5 years, looking at the faded outline on the wall where the hospital rail had been unbolted and patched over already, quicker than I expected. Then I opened that lockbox expecting nothing more than sentimental clutter, old photographs, maybe his father's war medal, the usual. What I found instead was the original, fully executed 2019 trust, the one naming me as primary beneficiary, along with a business card for the notary public who had witnessed it, stapled to the inside cover exactly the way my grandfather always kept his important paperwork. My mother, standing beside me, went very quiet and just said, "He kept a copy of everything, didn't he?" Which wasn't really a question.
I called that notary 2 days later, mostly out of habit, the same instinct that makes me double-check a filing deadline 3 times before I submit it. My hands were shaking a little when I dialed, which is not something that happens to me often. Her name was also on the 2023 amendment, the same notary, supposedly witnessing a signature 11 months after she had actually closed her practice and moved out of state to be near her grandchildren. She had no record of ever notarizing anything for my grandfather in 2023. She hadn't even been in the state to notarize anything for anyone that entire year, and she said so, clearly and on the record, the first time I asked, sounding almost as unsettled by the question as I felt asking it. I did not call Derek and scream at him, and I want to be honest with you about how badly I wanted to. Some nights that spring, I sat in my car in my own driveway for 20 minutes at a time, drafting furious texts I never sent, deleting every one of them before I went inside. Instead, I did what 11 years of drafting trust litigation documents had trained me to do without even thinking about it. I built a file. I brought everything I had to Patricia Vance, the senior estate litigation partner at my own firm, the woman who had trained me when I was 28 years old and still afraid of the copy machine. She had a forensic document examiner compare the 2 signatures side by side. The report came back 3 weeks later. The signature on the 2023 amendment showed inconsistencies in pressure and stroke pattern that were inconsistent with my grandfather's documented late-stage tremor and consistent instead with a slow, traced forgery, the kind that happens when someone copies a real signature stroke by stroke rather than signing it naturally in one motion. Patricia asked me, sitting across from me at her desk, what I actually wanted to do about all of it. I told her I didn't want a scene. I didn't want to show up at Derek's house and yell at him in front of his own children. I wanted the court to decide, on the record in front of everyone who needed to hear it, exactly what had happened to my grandfather's estate. She told me that was, in her professional opinion, both the smartest and the single most dangerous thing I could possibly ask for. Dangerous for him, she clarified when she saw my face.
Not for you. You have the paper. He has an explanation. Paper wins that argument in front of a judge every single time. Explanations don't. On Tuesday after Labor Day, I had Derek formally served with a petition to contest the trust amendment, filed in probate court alleging undue influence, breach of fiduciary duty, and forgery. Attached to the petition were 3 things: the original, fully executed 2019 trust from the Lockbox, the forensic signature examiner's full report, and a sworn statement from a notary who, according to state licensing records, had been living 400 miles away on the exact date she supposedly notarized his signature. I didn't call to warn him first. I let the process server do that. Derek called me 7 times in the 4 hours after he was served. I have the call log saved, because at that point I was saving everything. I didn't answer a single one of those calls. By that evening, his texts had shifted in tone 3 separate times. The first, an hour after service, "We need to talk about this before it goes any further." The fourth, 2 hours later, "You are destroying this family, Mel, I hope you know that." And the last, close to midnight, a single voicemail where his voice cracked halfway through a sentence about how he'd just been trying to help settle things faster for everyone before he caught himself mid-thought and hung up without finishing. I saved that voicemail too, along with every text, screenshotted and dated. Patricia said we might need it eventually. We did. The deposition happened 4 months later, in a conference room 2 floors below my own, which felt strange in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for. Derek's attorney tried 3 separate times to imply that I somehow manipulated a dying, medicated man into signing a trust that heavily favored me, pointing out that I lived in his house, drove him everywhere, controlled his day-to-day schedule. At one point, he asked me directly, "Isn't it true that you had every opportunity to influence your—"
Patricia let him finish each round, then calmly reminded the room that the trust in question had been signed in 2019, 5 years before my grandfather's death, at a time when his own treating physician's notes described him as fully oriented and competent, and that the document actually being contested for undue influence was the 2023 amendment, the one Derek himself had brought to that outside attorney's office 3 weeks before the funeral, at a point when my grandfather's own medical chart documented worsening confusion tied to his declining kidney function. I'll admit something else here, because this story isn't really worth telling if I only tell you the parts that make Derek look simple. He wasn't simple. In the months before my grandfather died, Derek's own financial planning practice had quietly lost 2 of his largest clients after a downturn hit the local market he specialized in, and I found out later, through discovery, that he'd taken out a second mortgage on his own condo just to stay afloat during that stretch, and had fallen behind on payments to his kids' private school by that same winter. I don't say that to excuse what he did. I say it because I think it's the actual truth of how people like Derek talk themselves into things, not as villains twirling a mustache, but as someone under enough financial pressure that "I'll just borrow against what's coming to me anyway," technically, starts to sound, to them, almost reasonable, almost temporary, almost like something they'll fix later once things settle down. I think somewhere in his own head, Derek genuinely believed he'd find a way to make it all balance out before anyone ever had to know. He just ran out of time before my grandfather did. The hearing itself came 6 months after the deposition, in a probate courtroom with maybe 30 people scattered across the gallery benches. My mother, my Aunt Carol, cousins I hadn't seen since the funeral, Jessica sitting 3 rows back from Derek rather than beside him, and Derek himself, sitting very straight in a suit that looked like it cost more than his monthly mortgage payment used to. The room smelled like old carpet and coffee, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly the entire time, the kind of ordinary, unremarkable setting where I was about to say out loud, for the first time, everything I'd spent almost a year not saying. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't raise my voice once. I laid it out exactly the way I had laid it out for Patricia months earlier, item by item, like a ledger read out loud. $46,000 in caregiving costs I personally covered, receipts for every dollar. 3 dialysis trips a week, every week for 5 straight years, calendar entries for all 780 of them, a signature that didn't match the documented tremor in his own medical chart, a notary who, according to the state's own licensing board, hadn't even lived in the state when she supposedly notarized the amendment, a house listing that went up 2 weeks after the funeral, before anyone besides Derek had ever laid eyes on that amendment at all. My voice caught exactly once when I described finding him that Tuesday morning, and I saw my mother reach for my Aunt Carol's hand in the gallery, without either of them quite looking at each other. At one point, Derek's attorney tried to argue that Derek had simply been managing a complicated family situation the best way he knew how, during an emotionally difficult time for everyone involved. Derek himself, when the judge asked him directly whether he had drafted the amendment language, went quiet for a long moment before he finally said, "I thought I deserved it more than she did. I understood money. I was the one who was supposed to understand these things. I told myself I was just protecting what was already ours." It was almost word for word the same line he'd used on me a dozen times over the years, at family dinners, on the phone, in half-joking texts about the trust. "Family always comes first, Mel. I'm just doing what's right for all of us." Except this time, sitting in a courtroom with a forensic report open in front of the judge, it didn't sound like loyalty anymore. It sounded like a confession he hadn't planned on giving out loud. Somewhere behind me, I heard my Aunt Carol make a small, sharp sound, like she'd been holding her breath the entire time he spoke and had only just remembered to let it out.
During the recess before closing arguments, Derek's attorney approached Patricia with an offer: withdraw the petition and Derek would work something out privately. A partial repayment, no formal admission of wrongdoing, the whole thing kept quietly out of the public record, where the rest of the family and his own remaining clients would never have to see it. I told Patricia to tell them no. I hadn't spent almost a year building a forensic case, hadn't sat through a deposition where Derek's own attorney tried to paint me as the manipulator just to let Derek quietly repay a fraction of what he'd taken and walk away with his professional license fully intact. I wanted a ruling. I wanted it on the record, in writing, with my grandfather's actual wishes restored exactly the way he'd signed them at that kitchen table in 2019. Patricia relayed my answer in 4 words, standing in the hallway outside the courtroom. She wants a verdict. The judge invalidated the 2023 amendment entirely in a written ruling that used the word forgery 3 separate times. She reinstated the original 2019 trust in full and ordered Derek to personally repay the roughly $210,000 in trust assets he had already spent, including a down payment on a lake house he'd purchased 4 months after the funeral, plus interest and legal fees on top of that. When Derek couldn't produce that amount in cash, the court ordered the forced sale of his condo and the liquidation of his remaining investment accounts to satisfy the judgment in full. The state's Financial Licensing Board opened its own separate investigation the following month, using the very same forensic signature report as its starting point, and the county's district attorney's office requested a copy of the full case file shortly after that, though as of this recording, no criminal charges have been filed. I sat in the gallery when the judge read the final order out loud, and I remember focusing very hard on my own hands folded in my lap, because I didn't trust my face not to show exactly how long I'd been waiting to hear those words said by someone with the authority to make them permanent. If you've ever done the quiet, unglamorous work in your family, the driving and the paperwork and the middle-of-the-night phone calls nobody else wanted to make, and then watched someone else tried to walk away with the credit or the inheritance, subscribe to Revenge Story right now, because I promise you the paperwork remembers, even when people don't. My Aunt Carol didn't speak to me for almost a year after the ruling came down. I understood it, even while it hurt. Derek was still her son, no matter what a probate court had found, and watching your child's forged signature described as a forgery 3 times in a written judicial opinion isn't something any mother recovers from quickly. She reached out again this past spring over a short, careful phone call. Mostly, I think, because Derek had stopped speaking to her, too, by then, once the licensing board formally revoked his registration and he packed up and moved 2 states away to start over under his mother's maiden name on his new business cards. We haven't talked about that Thanksgiving toast in 2020, and I don't think we ever will. Some things you just let stay buried, even in a story about not letting things stay buried. My Aunt Carol didn't speak to me for almost a year after the ruling came down. I understood it, even while it hurt. Derek was still her son, no matter what a probate court had found, and watching your child's forged signature described as a forgery 3 times in a written judicial opinion isn't something any mother recovers from quickly. She reached out again this past spring over a short, careful phone call. Mostly, I think, because Derek had stopped speaking to her, too, by then, once the licensing board formally revoked his registration and he packed up and moved 2 states away to start over under his mother's maiden name on his new business cards. We haven't talked about that Thanksgiving toast in 2020, and I don't think we ever will. Some things you just let stay buried, even in a story about not letting things stay buried.
Derek's condo sold at a court-ordered auction 8 months ago for less than he owed on the second mortgage he'd taken out against it. I heard through a cousin that he's selling insurance now, in a state where none of this shows up on the first page of a background search, at least not yet. The state licensing board's public order revoking his registration is still searchable if you know his old professional name and know where to look. I don't know if he thinks about my grandfather much. I try not to think about that question too hard. Patricia retired from the firm this past winter, and at her retirement dinner, she told the story of my case to the entire table without using either of our real names, ending it the same way she'd ended it for me in her office that very first afternoon. The quiet ones always keep the receipts. I think about that line more than I probably should, usually right around tax season, when a new client walks into the office holding a manila folder that looks exactly like my grandfather's. As for me, I used part of the reinstated trust to set up a small scholarship fund in my grandfather's name at the Dialysis center where he spent 3 afternoons a week for the last 5 years of his life, covering transportation costs for patients who don't have someone able to drive them the way I drove him. 11 people have used it so far. It isn't $2 million, it was never supposed to replace anything, and it doesn't erase the year I lost with my Aunt Carol, or the version of Derek I used to actually like having at family dinners. It's just supposed to outlast the version of this story where Derek got to quietly keep what he took. People like to say blood is thicker than water. Nobody ever mentions that paperwork is thicker than both of them combined, and it's the only one of the 3 that actually holds up when a judge asks you to prove it. My grandfather understood fairness better than almost anyone I've ever known. I like to think that somewhere he'd recognize exactly what I did with what he left behind, and that he'd say it was the reasonable thing to do. He usually did. If this story meant something to you, that's exactly why Revenge Story exists. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace in your family and getting the truth on the record. I read every single one of them. And subscribe, because another quiet family finds out the truth doesn't stay buried.